Hello class, today we will be talking about the novel The Setting Sun by Dazai Osamu. This novel illustrates the story of an aristocratic society and its downfall. We will be getting into more details on that just in a short while. First, let us discuss what aristocracy really means. Aristocracy, in simple terms, is a form of government where the power is divided amongst families of high ruling class. These people are called aristocrats. Aristocrats are typically portrayed as people who are rich, and they usually have to behave and conduct themselves in a fancy and elegant way. The concept of aristocracy can sometimes appear in movies and films too. The novel The Setting Sun describes the transitional period of Japan from being an aristocratic society to a more industrialized society. The story is told from a perspective of the main character, Katsuko, who was born an aristocrat. Katsuko finds herself a victim of the transitional period of morality, and hence struggles to keep on living. As a result, Katsuko desperately finds purpose to her life, even if it meant betraying her own morality. Kazuko has a brother, Naoji, who was also born an aristocrat. In the novel, Naoji, in his journal, reveals the struggle he faces in his missing years and the deepest of his weaknesses, explaining why he resorted to drugs and alcoholism to escape the humiliation and shame he receives. Naoji also reveals the ugliness behind the human nature and explains how the only choice left for his aristocratic self was to commit suicide. Kazuko, who is 29 years old, lives with her mother. The novel portrays her mother as how one would ideally imagine an aristocrat to be. She is portrayed as a kind and caring person who is at the same time an elegant, graceful, and almost perfect woman who both Kazuko and her brother looks up to. Later in the novel, her health eventually worsens, resulting in her death. Kazuko's mother was used as a symbol of aristocracy itself in the novel, but we will get more into that later. Here is a brief summary of the major plot points in The Setting Sun in chronological order. From what we know, some of these events happened in the past. Such events include Kazuko's father's death, Kazuko's first marriage, Kazuko and her mother selling the house on Nishikata Street and moving to the countryside, and lastly Kazuko burning the snake eggs. From what us as readers know, the following happened in the present of the novel. Firstly, Naoji's return. Next, we also see Naoji's journal. Following that, Kazuko meets Uehara. Later on in the novel, Kazuko's mother's health also starts to worsen. Kazuko then starts sending letters to Uehara. After that, Kazuko's mother unfortunately dies. After the death of Kazuko's mother, Kazuko has an affair with Uehara, and following that is Naoji's suicide. And lastly, to end the novel off, Kazuko announces that she is pregnant. In the novel, every victim of this transitional period seems to yearn for a reason or purpose to life. The novel highlights the cruel and brutal reality of this period of transition, a result of Japan's economic depression after the war. We see characters like Naoji, Kazuko, and Uehara experiencing this pressure to commit suicide, as they find themselves losing the purpose to life, a result of the series of depressing turns their lives has taken. We get an idea of the theme the novel is trying to portray when we realize that this transitional society present in post-war Japan seems to have destroyed everyone's dream of achieving their ideal life, leaving most victims in a state of nihilism. In this video, we will be looking at two literary techniques, one of which will be a literary technique that can be seen from all types of literary pieces, including poems, prose, and many others. The other literary technique will be prose-specific. This means that this technique can only be found in text written in prose form. The first literary technique we will be looking at is plot. In this video, I'll be explaining how plot can be used by writers to highlight the thematic concern they wish to highlight. Plot consists of two parts, with the first one being plot structure and the second one being plot techniques. Firstly, plot structure. The plot structure of a literary piece is the sequence at which each event takes place in the piece. These events may not always happen in chronological order, especially in more complex pieces of literature. The plot structure of a literary piece usually consists of four stages: the exposition, the rising action, the climax, and finally the resolution. The exposition introduces the story and sets everything into context. It also introduces the readers to the characters in the story and hints to the reader what kind of person they really are. However, keep in mind that the initial portrayal of the setting and the character may differ from a later part in the story. The story will then introduce a conflict, and the rising action will follow the conflict. The rising action also acts as a build-up for the climax. The climax is usually the most exciting part of the story. This marks the turning point of the story, as the story usually takes a turn for the better. After the climax comes the falling action. Issues in the story begin to get resolved one by one, until eventually, some sort of resolution is reached. The resolution need not always be a happy one. In The Setting Sun, The exposition plays a very important role. The exposition in The Setting Sun introduces the idea of aristocracy through the use of Kazuko's mother. Kazuko's mother was unconcernedly picking up bones in her finger and chewing the meat off. Kazuko describes this uncivilized action of hers as not only charming, but strangely erotic when mother performs them. This perfect and elegant portrayal of the mother, the symbol of aristocracy itself, highlights the graceful nature of aristocracy in Kazuko and Naoji's eyes. This, in contrast with her mother's death, was able to highlight the tragic passing of aristocratic Japan, a parallel to how the disappearance of aristocratic Japan has utterly destroyed Kazuko and Naoji's dream of achieving stability. Despite her hands being described as distorted hands that did not belong to my mother, Kazuko still compares her death to Mary and the Pietà, suggesting that there is something divine and holy behind her passing, suggesting that the idea of aristocracy remains a subject of holiness and elegance in Kazuko's eyes, making the disappearance of aristocracy extra tragic. Secondly, plot techniques. Plot techniques are techniques used to propel the story and make the story more interesting. Examples of plot techniques include flashbacks, flash forwards, foreshadowing, suspense, and in some cases symbolism. These techniques help in the overall portrayal of the thematic constant the author wishes to highlight. In The Setting Sun, the author uses a lot of such techniques to highlight the downfall of the aristocratic Japan and the struggles the characters face when the stability of their lives are taken away from them. In this video, we will be discussing three main plot techniques, namely flashbacks, symbolism, and foreshadowing. The first symbol is the mother. As mentioned in plot structure, the mother is the ideal and perfect image of an aristocrat who is not afraid to express herself in her own ways. As such, the mother is a symbol of aristocracy. Kazuko, in the novel, describes her mother as the last lady of Japan, highlighting the fact that the death of the mother signified the end of aristocratic and traditional Japan. The second symbol is the snake. In the novel, the snake symbolizes the idea of malice and betrayal. The snake was first used as the title of the first chapter, foreshadowing Kazuko's betrayal towards her morality as an aristocrat. In a flashback, the symbol of the snake was first introduced to the readers. Kazuko in the flashback mentions that she had the unbearable sensation that some horrible little snake, which would shorten mother's life, had crawled into her breast. This foreshadows the fact that Kazuko was going to betray her morality as an aristocrat in order to find a purpose to her own life, which meant that she was going to ultimately betray her mother, who is a symbol of aristocracy itself. Later in the novel, Kazuko and her mother moves to the countryside as they have lost their wealth and the financial situation becomes unstable. The snake was once again brought up to foreshadow Kazuko's betrayal towards her morality. This idea of betrayal was proven in chapter 5, when Kazuko's mother dreams of a snake on her porch just before her death. The snake here symbolizes Kazuko's betrayal towards her mother in wishing to bear the child of Uehara and betraying her morality in doing so. As seen, through the use of flashback, Dazai Osamu was able to use foreshadowing and symbolism to highlight the idea of the downfall of the aristocratic society and how it leads to the destruction of the character's hope for an ideal and stable life. Dazai Osamu uses a series of flashbacks to help in the illustration of the novel. Some of these flashbacks were used as platforms to introduce certain plot points or to foreshadow a certain event that was going to take place later in the novel. For example, when Kazuko thinks back on the time she attempted to burn the snake eggs. This flashback helps introduce the symbol of a snake, allowing the author to reference it once again during her mother's death and foreshadows Kazuko's betrayal, as discussed just now. Dazai Osamu illustrates the story through the repeated use of flashbacks. This creates a lack of distance between the past and the present in the novel. When I was reading the novel, I often found it difficult to differentiate between the past and the present. It was almost as if the past and the present were merged into one, highlighting how these occurrences in the past come back to haunt the characters as they further transition into this period of brutality and cruelty. In Kazuko's instance, the recurring flashbacks of unpleasant moments, such as her burning the snake eggs, causing a fire, her father's death, her conversation with a friend, and them losing their house, seems to haunt Kazuko the further we get into the novel, highlighting the depressing nature of this transitional period where one's hope for an ideal life seems to be brutally shattered. The prose-specific technique we will be looking at in this video is the idea of narrative perspectives. There are three main types of narrative perspective, namely first person, second person, and third person. We will be going through all of these one by one. Firstly, first person narrative point of view. The narrator usually addresses himself using the pronoun I while us as readers receive a first-person recount of the stories from the person's point of view. Some characteristics of the first-person narrative point of view includes the fact that the persona is able to directly convey their emotions or thoughts to the reader. Furthermore, the persona themselves take part in the story as a character. However, do keep in mind that in such a narrative, the story may be biased as us as readers gain limited access to the other characters' thoughts and emotions.
Hey, you. You're finally awake.
Secondly, second-person narrative point of view. This narrative point of view is rarely found in text nowadays. The second-person POV addresses the readers directly through the second-person pronoun you. It is usually used in narratives that aim to evoke strong feelings from the reader, as it directly addresses the reader, almost putting the reader on the spot. Thirdly, third-person narrative point of view. In a narrative that utilizes the third-person point of view, there is usually a narrator that narrates the story to you as the reader. Characters in the story are addressed in third-person pronouns such as he, she, or they. The following are some ways to categorize such third-person narratives. An omniscient narrator is one who is all-knowing, as suggested by the prefix omni and the suffix science. Omniscient narrators are usually aware of what will happen later on in the novel, as well as what is happening at that moment in the novel. A limited narrator is one who is only aware of what is happening at that moment in the novel, almost as if they are live streaming the story as it happens. An intrusive narrator is one who provides their own comments on the situation they are describing now, like how a commentator will commentate over a sports match or anything of that nature.
Bruh.
An unintrusive narrator, on the other hand, simply describes the story without contributing their personal thoughts. An external narrator is one who is purely describing the story itself, without revealing the character's inner emotions and feelings. An internal narrator, on the other hand, exposes the inside of a character's mind to the readers. In The Setting Sun, Dazai Osamu utilizes the first-person narrative point of view, describing the story from Kazuko's point of view. Through this, us as readers can better sympathize with Kazuko as we follow the story. It is effective in highlighting the tragic nature of the novel. Take for instance Chapter 5, when Kazuko realizes that her mother's hand was swollen. She says, "I wanted to weep out loud. The distorted hand did not belong to my mother." The first-person point of view here allows the reader to experience the shock Kazuko experiences firsthand. The use of the pronouns my in my mother suggests a sense of intimacy Kazuko finds between herself and her mother. This helped leave a greater impact on the reader as we realize that Kazuko's once beautiful and perfect mother is now almost unbearable to the eyes. Furthermore, the first-person point of view was further utilized in the novel through the use of journals, testaments, and letters. Through this, the author was able to bring to us the most direct and unfiltered thoughts of the character. Take for example Naoji's journal. In Naoji's journal, Dazai Osamu uses a repetition of fragmented rhetorical questions. Philosophy, lies. Principles, lies. Ideals, lies. Order, lies. Sincerity, truth, purity, all lies. To highlight Naoji's loss of faith in humanity upon understanding what humans are truly like. This helped bring to light how the war and subsequently this period of transition has exposed the true nature of mankind. The use of an anaphora, when I, also helped emphasize how, when Naoji was really in pain, they started a rumor that he was faking suffering. The fact that the journal was narrated from a first-person point of view puts us in Naoji's shoes, enabling us to understand the pain and humiliation he experiences in his time in the South Pacific, allowing us to sympathize with Naoji. This humiliation and shame he was receiving was also precisely why he became suicidal and had to rely on drugs and alcohol to stay alive. In conclusion, a piece of literary text that follows the natural flow of speaking can usually be referred to as a prose piece. A prose piece in literature usually illustrates a story that tries to reflect a certain theme, which is usually done through the portrayal of a binary tension between two opposing ideas. In a similar fashion, a piece of poetry also aims to highlight a certain theme through a binary tension. However, the difference between prose and poetry lies within the techniques used and the way the piece is portrayed. As we have discussed in the previous part of the video, prose usually utilizes techniques such as narrative perspectives and narrative voice to draw the audience into the story, while in poetry, there is a focus on form, which includes the poetic structure and its rhythm. With that, we have come to the end of our lesson. Hope you found this video useful. Thank you for watching.